The mop handle felt foreign in her hands, its weight nothing like the rifle she'd carried through 3 tours in Afghanistan. Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez, though no one here knew her rank, gripped the wooden shaft and tried to remember when. Cleaning had become an act of survival rather than simple maintenance. The stench from the porta-potties behind the construction site mixed with the August heat, creating a miasma that reminded her of forward operating bases and things she'd rather forget. "Faster, Maria," barked Jake Morrison, the site supervisor, using the name from her fake papers. His hard hat sat crooked on his balding head, and sweat stains mapped territories of contempt across his polo shirt. "These toilets don't clean themselves, and the inspectors come Monday." Elena Maria to everyone here nodded without looking up. 3 months ago, she'd been leading convoys through IED-riddled highways. Now she was invisible, just another undocumented worker grateful for minimum wage and the chance to disappear. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd fought for this country's freedom abroad, only to scrub its shit in silence at home. Behind the chain-link fence, the office building rose like a glass monument to everything she couldn't touch. Through its windows, she could see men in suits gesturing at blueprints, making decisions that would shape the city's skyline. None of them had ever held a dead soldier in their arms or watched a convoy burn. None of them knew that the woman cleaning there Latrines had once called in airstrikes that saved entire platoons. "You speak English?" Jake's voice cut through her thoughts. He stood too close, his breath reeking of coffee and casual authority. "I asked you a question, sweetheart." Elena's jaw tightened. The endearment landed like a slap, but she'd learned to swallow such insults whole. "Si, un poco," she replied, letting her accent thicken. The lie came easier now, each syllable a small betrayal of the woman who'd once briefed generals on tactical assessments. Jake laughed, a sound like grinding gravel. "A little," she says. "That's more than most of you people." He kicked at a cigarette butt near her feet. "Well, since you speak un poco English, let me make this crystal clear. These facilities need to be spotless. The health department's been sniffing around, and if we fail inspection, heads will roll. Starting with yours." The threat hung in the humid air like diesel fumes. Elena had heard worse from Taliban fighters, but somehow Jake's casual cruelty cut deeper. At least her enemies had respected her enough to try to kill her. Here, she was just another faceless brown woman, useful only for the jobs no one else would take. As Jake walked away, his boots crunching on gravel, Elena caught sight of Rosa Martinez emerging from behind the fence. Rosa worked the front desk at the construction company, one of the few legal employees who bothered to acknowledge the cleanup crew. She was young, maybe 25, with kind eyes that reminded Elena of her sister Carmen, the sister who thought she was dead. "Está bien?" Rosa asked, approaching with a bottle of water. Her voice carried genuine concern, a rare currency in this place. Elena accepted the water gratefully. "Sí, gracias." The cold liquid soothed her throat, and for a moment, she allowed herself to appreciate this small kindness. Rosa was studying for her citizenship test, working double shifts to support her mother and younger brother. She deserved better than this place. Better than Jake Morrison's casual racism and the way the other supervisors looked through her like she was glass. "He's worse today," Rosa whispered, glancing toward the trailer where Jake had disappeared. His wife filed for divorce, found out about the secretary. She shook her head. "Men like that, they think their pain gives them permission to hurt everyone else." Elena understood. She'd seen it in war zones, how trauma metastasized into cruelty, how the wounded became the wounding. But understanding didn't make it easier to swallow Jake's contempt or pretend she was less than she was. Every fiber of her training screamed against this submission, against this careful choreography of invisibility she'd perfected since deserting her own life. The desertion had been necessary. After Kandahar, after watching her convoy burn while she was powerless to save them, Something had broken inside her. The nightmares came first, then the drinking, then the inevitable confrontation with her commanding officer about fitness for duty. Rather than face the psychiatric evaluation that would end her career, she'd simply vanished. Let them think her dead. Let her family grieve a hero rather than watch her become another casualty of an invisible war. Now she cleaned toilets with hands that had once assembled sniper rifles in complete darkness. She spoke in broken Spanish to hide a mind that could calculate trajectory and wind speed by instinct. She was Maria the cleaning lady, grateful and quiet and utterly forgettable. But forgettable had its advantages. In 3 months, she'd learned things about Morrison Construction that would make the FBI very interested. She'd seen the cash payments to city inspectors, overheard phone calls about cutting corners on the Memorial Hospital project, witnessed the systematic wage theft that kept workers like Rosa trapped in cycles of poverty. Elena finished the last porta potty and wheeled her cart toward the storage shed. As she passed the trailer, Jake's voice drifted through the thin walls. Doesn't matter if the concrete's substandard. By the time anyone notices, we'll have our money and be on to the next project. These wetbacks don't exactly have the EPA on speed dial. His laughter made Elena's stomach turn. The Memorial Hospital was supposed to honor veteran soldiers like the ones she'd lost in Afghanistan. Now it would be built with inferior materials by a man who saw immigrant workers as expendable as ammunition. She stored her cleaning supplies with military precision, each item in its designated place. The routine was soothing, a small order, imposed on a chaotic world. But as she prepared to leave, something caught her eye, a manila envelope tucked behind a box of industrial cleaners. Her name was written on it. Not Maria Gonzalez, but Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez, 75th Ranger Regiment. Her blood turned to ice water. Someone knew. With trembling fingers, she opened the envelope. Inside was a photograph of her in full combat gear, standing beside a Humvee in Kandahar province. Written on the back in blue ink, "We need to talk. Tomorrow, 6 a.m., Riverside Diner, come alone. A friend who remembers heroes." Elena's knees nearly buckled. The photograph was from her last deployment, taken days before the convoy attack that had shattered her world. Only a handful of people had copies, and most of them were dead. Who could have found her here? And more importantly, what did they want? She slipped the photograph into her pocket and locked the shed. As she walked toward the bus stop, every shadow seemed to hide a threat, every passing car a potential enemy. For 3 months, she'd lived in careful anonymity. Now someone had shattered that peace with a single photograph and a cryptic message. The bus ride home took 45 minutes through neighborhoods that grew progressively shabbier. Elena watched the city scroll past through grimy windows, her mind racing through possibilities. A fellow veteran? Military intelligence? Or something worse, someone connected to the things she'd seen in Afghanistan, the classified operations that had left scars deeper than shrapnel. Her apartment was a studio in a building that had seen better decades. The lock stuck, the windows leaked, and the radiator clanged like a dying engine, but it was hers. More importantly, it was anonymous. She'd paid 6 months in advance with cash, told the super she was a hotel maid who spoke little English. One more invisible woman in a city full of them. Tonight, she sat on her narrow bed and studied the photograph until her eyes burned. The woman in the picture looked like a stranger, confident, capable, surrounded by soldiers who trusted her with their lives. That woman had believed in duty and honor and the sacred promise that no one gets left behind. That woman was dead, buried under the weight of survivor's guilt and the knowledge that sometimes, despite everything you do, everyone gets left behind anyway. But tomorrow she would have to resurrect her. Someone knew her secret, and secrets, Elena had learned, were the most dangerous weapons of all. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Elena didn't sleep. She sat by her window, watching the street below while shadows painted stories across her walls. Every car that slowed made her tense. Every footstep in the hallway brought her hand instinctively to where her sidearm should have been. At 4 a.m., she gave up the pretense and made coffee, the ritual as precise as field stripping a weapon. The woman staring back from her bathroom mirror looked like a casualty of her own war. Dark circles mapped sleepless nights beneath brown eyes that had seen too much. Her hair, once regulation short, had grown past her shoulders, another layer of disguise, another way to distance herself from the soldier she'd been. She practiced Maria's accent while brushing her teeth, letting the syllables roll off her tongue like a prayer in a language she was forgetting. By 5:30, she was dressed in the same worn jeans and faded T-shirt that comprised Maria's entire wardrobe. The bus to downtown was nearly empty, carrying night shift workers home and early shift workers to their various crucifixions. Elena recognized most of the faces by now: Rosa's cousin Miguel, who cleaned offices; Mrs. Chun, who worked the laundry service at the downtown hotels; Carlos, whose construction injuries had left him hobbling but still needing to feed his family. These were her people now, the invisible army that kept the city running while the real citizens slept. They deserved better than contractors like Jake Morrison, better than a system designed to chew them up and spit them out. But Elena had learned that deserving and receiving were two different countries, separated by an ocean of indifference. The Riverside Diner squatted between a pawn shop and a check cashing store, its neon sign flickering like a dying heartbeat. Elena arrived 10 minutes early and chose a booth with clear sight lines to all entrances. Old habits died hard, even when the war followed you home. She ordered coffee and waited. The diner filled slowly with truckers and shift workers, people who lived on the margins of mourning. The waitress, a woman named Dolores with tired eyes and gentle hands, kept her cup full without being asked. Small kindnesses in a hard world. At exactly 6 a.m., the door chimed and Elena's breath caught in her throat. The man who entered moved with the careful precision of someone carrying invisible wounds. Average height, graying temples, wearing a mechanic's coveralls that couldn't quite hide the military bearing in his shoulders. Their eyes met across the diner, and she saw recognition flicker in his gaze like muzzle flash. He slid into the booth across from her, close enough that she could see the small scar above his left eyebrow and the faded tattoo on his forearm. 75th Rangers, the same unit she'd served with. But she didn't recognize his face, which meant he knew her reputation without knowing her personally. "Staff Sergeant Vasquez," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of ceremony. "I'm Master Sergeant Tom Davidson, retired. We never served together, but I know your record." Elena's coffee tasted like ashes. "I don't know what you're talking about." Davidson smiled sadly. "Kandahar Province, September 15, 2019. Your convoy was ambushed on Highway 1. IED took out the lead vehicle, then coordinated small arms fire from elevated positions. You called in air support and held the position for 3 hours while evacuating casualties. Bronze Star with V device. Purple Heart. Army Commendation Medal with oak leaf cluster. Each medal felt like a stone dropped into her chest. That woman is dead." "No, she's not. She's cleaning toilets for a man who wouldn't last 5 minutes in a real fight." Davidson leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I know what happened after. I know about the nightmares, the drinking, the way the army wanted to warehouse you in some psychiatric facility. I know why you ran." Elena's hands trembled slightly around her coffee cup. "What do you want? To remind you who you are. To tell you there are people who remember what you did over there and what you're capable of doing here." He pulled out a manila folder and slid it across the table. "Jake Morrison, Morrison Construction, take a look." Against her better judgment, Elena opened the folder. Inside were photographs, financial records, and what looked like surveillance reports. Morrison with known organized crime figures. Morrison's company receiving no-bid contracts worth millions. Morrison's systematic exploitation of undocumented workers, including threats of deportation for anyone who complained about working conditions. "How did you—" "I run a security consulting firm now," Davidson explained. "Mostly background checks and corporate investigations. But sometimes when I see soldiers being forgotten or good people being crushed, I remember that some fights are worth having." Elena studied a photograph of Morrison shaking hands with a man she recognized from FBI wanted posters. "This is evidence of federal crimes." "It is, but evidence needs someone credible to present it. Someone with an unimpeachable record of service. Someone like a decorated veteran who happened to witness these crimes firsthand." The implications hit her like incoming fire. "You want me to come forward? Blow my cover? I want you to remember that hiding isn't living, and that some causes are bigger than our own survival." Davidson's eyes held the kind of intensity she'd seen in combat commanders making impossible decisions. "That memorial hospital. Morrison's building? It's supposed to honor veterans. But if it's built with substandard materials by a company that exploits workers, what kind of memorial is that?" Elena closed the folder, her mind spinning through tactical considerations. Coming forward meant exposing herself to military prosecutors who still wanted answers about her disappearance. It meant facing her family, her former comrades, everyone who thought she was dead. It meant abandoning the careful anonymity that had kept her sane for 3 months. But it also meant Rosa and Miguel and Mrs. Chun might have a chance at justice. It meant the memorial hospital would honor veterans properly instead of becoming another monument to corruption. It meant Maria Gonzalez could disappear, and Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez could finally stop running from her own shadow. "I need time to think." Davidson nodded. 24 hours. "After that, I turn this over to the FBI with or without you. Morrison's scheduled to break ground on the hospital next week. Once construction begins in earnest, stopping him becomes much harder." He stood to leave, then paused. "For what it's worth, Sergeant, running away from Kandahar doesn't make you a coward. Sometimes the bravest thing is admitting you're human, but staying hidden when you can help people. That's not the woman who held that position for 3 hours under fire." Elena watched him leave through the diner's grease-stained window. Around her, the morning shift continued its eternal dance. Coffee poured. Orders taken, another day begun in the service of survival. But Davidson's words echoed in her mind like artillery fire, impossible to ignore. She returned to the construction site, with her head spinning and her heart hammering against her ribs. The morning routine felt surreal, now collecting her cleaning supplies, checking in with the supervisor, becoming Maria Gonzalez once again. But everything had changed. She was no longer hiding. She was conducting reconnaissance. Rosa greeted her with her usual warm smile. "Como estas, Maria? You look tired." "Didn't sleep well," Elena replied, the truth hiding inside the lie. She wanted to tell Rosa everything about the investigation, about the choice she was facing, about the possibility that things might finally change. But Rosa's safety depended on her remaining ignorant for now. Instead, Elena listened more carefully to conversations she'd been ignoring. Jake Morrison's phone calls took on new significance when filtered through Davidson's evidence. The casual cruelty toward workers looked different when seen as part of a larger pattern of exploitation. Even the way Morrison treated Rosa, the lingering looks, the inappropriate comments, the implied threats revealed itself as another weapon in an arsenal of intimidation. At lunch, Elena sat with the other cleaning crew members in the shade of the office building. Carlos complained about his check being short again. Miguel mentioned that his cousin had been fired without warning after asking about overtime pay. Mrs. Chun, who barely spoke English, pantomimed how a supervisor had grabbed her inappropriately, then laughed when she protested. These weren't just workplace grievances. They were war crimes committed in civilian clothing. And Elena realized she'd been AWOL not just from the army, but from the fight that mattered most, the one happening right here, right now, to people who couldn't fight back. As the afternoon wore on, she found herself cataloging everything with military precision. Which supervisors were complicit? Which workers might be willing to testify? Which documents might be accessible? Which security cameras had blind spots? The tactical mind she'd tried to bury was rising to the surface like a body from deep water. By quitting time, Elena had made her decision. Not the smart decision, not the safe decision, but the right one. The kind of decision that had gotten her unit home from Kandahar, even when it cost her everything else. She would resurrect Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez. She would give Davidson his credible witness. She would blow up Maria Gonzalez's quiet life and trust that something better could be built from the wreckage. But first, she had to call her sister Carmen. 3 months of believing Elena was dead had probably been agony. Tonight, Elena would return from the grave and try to explain why she'd put everyone she loved through that pain. The phone call could wait until she got home. Right now, she had one last day as Maria Gonzalez to survive. The call to Carmen went as badly as Elena expected. 3 hours of tears, accusations, disbelief, and finally the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that comes from emotional combat. Carmen was furious, rightfully so, but beneath the anger was relief so profound it made Elena's chest ache. Her sister had been planning Elena's memorial service. Now she had to figure out how to unplan it. The family thinks you're dead, Elena. Mom lights candles for you every Sunday. Dad won't even say your name because it breaks his heart. And you've been cleaning toilets this whole time? Carmen's voice cracked over the phone connection. Do you have any idea what you've put us through? Elena stared at her reflection in the apartment window, seeing both women superimposed, Maria the ghost and Elena the soldier. I couldn't face coming home broken. I couldn't let you see me like that. We've seen you broken before. Remember when you were 16 and wrecked Dad's truck? Remember when you didn't get into West Point the first time? We loved you through all of it, and we would have loved you through this too. The words hit harder than any I'd blast. Elena had survived 3 tours by learning to compartmentalize emotion, but her sister's voice stripped away every defense she'd built. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to fully feel the weight of what she'd lost, not just her identity, but her place in the world, her connection to everyone who mattered. After the call, Elena sat in darkness until dawn, preparing for what felt like her final mission. At 6 a.m., she dressed in Maria's clothes one last time and made her way to the construction site. Today would be different. Today, she would stop just observing and start collecting evidence. The morning began normally enough. Jake Morrison arrived, hungover and belligerent, barking orders at workers who couldn't fight back. The other supervisors fell into their familiar patterns of casual cruelty. But Elena noticed things she'd missed before. How they coordinated their harassment, how they used the threat of immigration raids to silence complaints, how they systematically stole wages by manipulating time cards. At 10 a.m., her opportunity arrived. Morrison left for a meeting, and the trailer where he kept his files stood momentarily unguarded. Elena had learned to pick locks during infiltration training, and the trailer's security was laughably inadequate compared to Taliban safe houses. Inside, she found a treasure trove of incriminating documents. Payroll records showing wage theft, safety inspection reports that had been falsified, communications with city officials that detailed explicit bribery schemes. Most damaging of all, she found Morrison's personal safe hidden behind a filing cabinet, secured with a combination lock that took her less than 5 minutes to crack. The safe contained everything Davidson needed and more: recorded phone conversations, photographs of meetings with organized crime figures, and detailed financial records showing how Morrison laundered money through shell companies. But it also contained something that made Elena's blood run cold: a list of problem workers marked for deportation, with Rosa Martinez's name at the top. Elena photographed everything with a phone she'd bought specifically for this purpose. Military training had taught her to document thoroughly and think tactically. This evidence would destroy Morrison, but only if she could get it to the authorities before he realized what she'd taken. As she worked, voices approached the trailer. Elena had less than 30 seconds to close the safe, restore everything to its original position, and slip out the back door. She made it with 10 seconds to spare, her heart hammering like automatic weapons fire. The rest of the morning passed in tense normalcy. Elena cleaned bathrooms while planning her next moves. She needed to contact Davidson, coordinate with law enforcement, and somehow protect Rosa and the other workers from retaliation. But Morrison wasn't stupid. He'd noticed the safe had been opened eventually, and when he did, the lives of everyone on that list would be in immediate danger. At lunch, Rosa approached with news that confirmed Elena's worst fears. "Maria, something's wrong. Mr. Morrison called me into his office this morning. He asked strange questions about you, how long you've been here, whether you have family, if you've ever mentioned anything about your past." Rosa's eyes were bright with worry. "I think he suspects something." Elena's blood chilled. If Morrison was investigating her, it meant he'd already noticed signs that Maria Gonzalez wasn't who she claimed to be. Maybe he'd spotted inconsistencies in her backstory, or maybe someone had recognized her despite her careful disguise. Either way, her cover was blown. "Rosa, listen to me carefully," Elena said, dropping the accent and speaking in crisp, unaccented English. "You need to go home today and stay there. Don't come to work tomorrow. Don't answer your phone if Morrison calls." Rosa's eyes widened in shock. "Maria? You speak your English. My name isn't Maria. I can't explain everything right now, but Morrison is dangerous, and you're in trouble just for knowing me." Elena gripped Rosa's shoulders. "Promise me you'll stay away from here until this is over." Before Rosa could respond, Jake Morrison's voice cut across the construction site like a buzzsaw. "Martinez, get over here, now." Rosa's face went white. Elena could see the fear flooding her features, the recognition that whatever was happening was much bigger and more dangerous than workplace harassment. But Rosa was young and scared and had been conditioned to obey authority figures, even ones who wished her harm. "Go," Elena whispered, "but remember what I said." Elena watched Rosa walk toward Morrison's trailer with the sick certainty that she was watching a friend march toward danger. Everything in her training screamed to intervene, to place herself between Rosa and whatever Morrison had planned. But revealing herself now would only make things worse for everyone. Morrison kept Rosa in his trailer for 20 minutes. When she emerged, her face was streaked with tears, and she moved like someone in shock. Elena tried to approach her, but Rosa shook her head and hurried toward the parking lot. Whatever Morrison had said to her, it had been effective. The afternoon dragged by with the weight of impending catastrophe. Elena finished her cleaning duties while monitoring radio chatter, watching for signs that Morrison was preparing to take action against the workers on his list. At 4 p.m., her worst fears were confirmed when she overheard Morrison on the phone. "Tomorrow morning, 6 a.m., I want them all picked up, the girl, the old Chinese lady, and especially that new cleaner who's been asking too many questions." Elena's blood turned to ice. Morrison wasn't just planning to fire them. He was coordinating with ICE to have them deported. The irony was devastating. Elena, who had served her country with distinction, would be lumped in with the undocumented workers Morrison wanted to eliminate. But more than that, Rosa and Mrs. Chun would be destroyed by deportation, separated from families and thrust into countries they barely remembered. She had to act tonight. Waiting for Davidson's timeline was No longer an option. Elena finished her shift and left the construction site for what she knew would be the last time. As Maria Gonzalez anyway. Tomorrow, if she was lucky, she would return as Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez, armed with enough evidence to bring down Morrison's entire operation. But first, she had to warn the others. Rosa lived with her mother and brother in an apartment complex. 20 minutes away by bus, Mrs. Chun lived in Chinatown with her extended family. Miguel lived in a trailer park on the south side of town. All of them were in immediate danger, and all of them trusted Elena Maria enough to listen if she told them to run. The evening became a tactical operation. Elena used cash to rent a car, then spent the next 4 hours driving across the city, warning people and helping them disappear. Some listened. Others thought she was crazy. Mrs. Chun's grandson, who spoke fluent English, helped translate Elena's warnings into Mandarin, and the family was packed and gone within an hour. Rosa was harder to convince, but when Elena showed her the photographs from Morrison's safe, the young woman finally understood the scope of the danger. By midnight, Elena had done everything she could to protect Morrison's targets. Now came the hard part, calling Davidson and setting in motion the chain of events that would either destroy Morrison or get them all killed. She made the call from a payphone outside a 24-hour diner, using coins and keeping the conversation brief. Davidson listened without interruption as Elena outlined what she'd discovered and the immediate threat to the workers. "Meet me at the FBI field office at 6 a.m., Davidson said. "Bring everything you have. We're going to end this." Elena hung up the phone and allowed herself one moment of pure terror. In 6 hours, she would walk into a federal building as a wanted deserter and hope that her evidence was enough to buy immunity. She would resurrect Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez and trust that the system she'd served would protect her from the system she'd betrayed. But as she drove through the empty streets toward her apartment, Elena felt something she hadn't experienced in months: hope. Tomorrow would bring consequences she couldn't control, but at least she would face them as herself, not as Maria Gonzalez, not as a ghost, but as the soldier she'd never stopped being. The war was coming home, and this time she intended to win it. The FBI field office in downtown sat like a fortress of glass and steel, its American flag snapping in the morning wind with military precision. Elena stood across the street at 5:30 a.m., watching early agents filter through security checkpoints, each one carrying the weight of federal authority she'd spent 3 months hiding from. Davidson was waiting for her in the lobby, looking like exactly what he was: a retired soldier comfortable with government buildings and official procedures. But Elena felt exposed, vulnerable in a way she hadn't experienced since her first day in Afghanistan. Every camera seemed trained on her face. Every security guard seemed ready to recognize her as the deserter she was. "Ready for this, Sergeant?" Davidson asked quietly. Elena squared her shoulders, feeling muscle memory kick in as she adopted the bearing she'd carried through 3 combat tours. As ready as anyone can be for professional suicide. The FBI special agent who met them was a woman named Sarah Chun, no relation to Mrs. Chun from the construction site, but the coincidence felt like a good omen. Agent Chun was maybe 40, with the kind of controlled intensity Elena recognized from military intelligence officers. She led them to a conference room lined with case files and evidence boards, the walls decorated with photographs of wanted criminals and organizational charts mapping criminal enterprises. "Master Sergeant Davidson has briefed me on your situation." Staff Sergeant Vasquez, Agent Chun began without preamble. "Before we discuss Morrison Construction, we need to address your military status. There's currently a warrant for your arrest related to desertion charges." Elena's stomach dropped, but she'd expected this. "I understand. I'm prepared to face whatever consequences." Agent Chun held up a hand. "Let me finish. Given the evidence you're providing and the circumstances of your disappearance, the military prosecutor's office has agreed to defer any action pending the resolution of this case." Your service record speaks for itself, and frankly, we need credible witnesses more than we need to prosecute traumatized veterans. The relief nearly buckled Elena's knees. She wasn't free, not yet, but she wouldn't be arrested today. That was more than she'd dared hope for. Now, Agent Chun continued, let's see what you have. Elena spent the next 2 hours laying out everything she'd discovered about Morrison Construction. The evidence was overwhelming. Photographs, documents, recorded conversations, financial records that traced money laundering through a dozen shell companies. Agent Chun's eyes grew wider with each revelation, and by the time Elena finished, the conference table looked like a war room planning a major offensive. This is incredible work, Agent Chun said finally. How did you manage to gather all this while maintaining your cover? Military training, Elena replied simply. Reconnaissance and intelligence gathering were part of my job in Afghanistan. The skills translate. Davidson leaned forward. What's the timeline for arrests? Today, Agent Chun said firmly. Morrison's planning to have workers deported this morning, which means we need to move fast. We've got teams standing by for simultaneous raids on Morrison Construction, Morrison's home, and the offices of 3 shell companies. We've also coordinated with ICE to ensure no deportation orders are executed while this operation is ongoing. Elena felt a surge of satisfaction mixed with lingering anxiety. What about the workers? Rosa, Mrs. Chen, Miguel, they're all in hiding, but they're scared. They'll be brought in as protected witnesses. Once Morrison and his associates are in custody, they'll be safe to resume their lives. Some may qualify for U visas as victims of serious crimes, which would give them legal status. The irony wasn't lost on Elena. She'd spent months hiding among undocumented workers, only to discover that they might achieve legal status while she faced military prosecution. But if her sacrifice meant Rosa could pursue her citizenship dreams, without fear, it was worth it. At 8 a.m., Agent Chun's radio crackled to life. Green light on all operations. Morrison's in custody. Elena closed her eyes and allowed herself one moment of pure vindication. Jake Morrison, who'd spent months treating her and other workers as disposable, was now the one in handcuffs. The man who'd built his wealth on exploitation and intimidation would finally face consequences for his actions. There's more, Agent Chun said, listening to her earpiece. Morrison's talking. He's naming names, trying to negotiate a deal. Apparently, this operation goes much deeper than we initially thought. Over the next hour, the scope of Morrison's criminal enterprise became clear. He wasn't just stealing wages and cutting corners on construction. He was part of a larger network that trafficked workers, laundered money for organized crime, and corrupted city officials throughout the region. The Memorial Hospital was just one project in a portfolio of fraud that stretched back years. By noon, 12 people had been arrested, including 2 city councilmen and a state inspector. The local news was running continuous coverage, with reporters breathlessly describing the largest corruption scandal in the city's history. Elena watched from the FBI conference room, feeling simultaneously vindicated and surreal. You did this, Davidson said, watching Elena's expression. All of it. Morrison, his associates, the whole network. None of this happens without you. Elena nodded slowly. The workers did this. I just documented what they were already experiencing. Agent Chun returned from another briefing. Morrison's lawyers requesting a meeting. Apparently, Morrison claims you're not who you say you are, that you're some kind of federal agent who was planted to investigate him. Elena laughed bitterly. In a way, he's right. I wasn't Maria Gonzalez, and I was investigating him. He just got the details wrong. This actually works in our favor, Agent Chun explained. Morrison's paranoia led him to document everything, including conversations where he admits to criminal activity. He was so focused on proving you were a government agent that he created evidence of his own crimes. The afternoon brought a parade of Morrison's victims to the FBI office. Rosa arrived first, accompanied by a translator and a victim's advocate. Her relief at seeing Elena was palpable, but so was her confusion about Elena's true identity. "You're really a soldier?" Rosa asked through the translator. "Not Maria the cleaning lady?" "I'm both," Elena replied carefully. "Maria was who I became when I needed to disappear. But Elena is who I've always been underneath." Rosa considered this for a long moment. "In my country, many people become someone else to survive. I understand. But Elena, she's braver than Maria." Mrs. Chun arrived next with most of her extended family in tow. Her grandson translated as she spoke rapidly in Mandarin, her hands gesturing emphatically. The translation revealed that Mrs. Chun had suspected Elena wasn't really an undocumented worker. She moved with too much confidence, watched people too carefully, carried herself like someone accustomed to authority. Miguel was the most emotional witness, a veteran himself, Army infantry, 2 tours in Iraq. He broke down when he learned Elena's true identity. "You let them treat you like that," he said through tears. "Morrison, those supervisors, they humiliated you, and you let them because you were protecting us." "We protect each other," Elena replied. "That's what soldiers do." Preparing and narrating. This type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying this story, please consider subscribing to our channel. By evening, Agent Chun had enough witness statements and corroborating evidence to guarantee convictions for Morrison and most of his network. The Memorial Hospital project would be investigated from top to bottom, with new contractors brought in to ensure it was built properly. The workers who'd been exploited would receive restitution, and many would qualify for visa protections that would let them remain in the country legally. But for Elena, the hardest conversation was still ahead. At 6 p.m., a black sedan pulled up to the FBI building. Elena watched from the conference room window as her sister Carmen stepped out, followed by their parents. Elena's mother, Maria Vasquez, the real Maria, Elena realized with bitter irony, moved slowly, as if each step carried the weight of 3 months of grief. Elena's father, Sergeant Major retired Roberto Vasquez, maintained the military bearing that had defined his 30-year career. But Elena could see the cost of her disappearance written in the lines around his eyes. "Your family's here," Agent Chun said gently. "We've arranged a private room. Take all the time you need." Elena stood on unsteady legs. She'd faced enemy fire, survived IED blasts, and endured 3 months of invisible servitude. But the prospect of facing her family's pain terrified her more than any battlefield. The reunion was everything Elena had dreaded and more. Her mother collapsed into her arms, sobbing in Spanish and English, and the wordless language of maternal grief. Carmen alternated between hugging her fiercely and pulling back to stare at her face, as if memorizing features she'd thought she'd never see again. But it was her father's reaction that broke Elena's heart. He simply stood at attention and saluted her, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Staff Sergeant," he said formally. "Good to have you back." Elena returned the salute, then closed the distance between them and hugged the man who'd taught her to be a soldier. For the first time in months, she felt like she was home. The explanations came in fits and starts, interrupted by tears and accusations, and moments of overwhelming relief. Elena told them about Kandahar, about the convoy, about the nightmares that had driven her to disappear rather than face psychiatric evaluation. She told them about Morrison Construction, about Rosa and Mrs. Chun and Miguel, about learning to be invisible while watching injustice unfold. "You could have come to us," her mother said repeatedly. "We would have helped you through it." "I know that now," Elena replied. "But at the time, I felt like I'd lost everything that made me who I was. I couldn't bear to let you see me that broken." Carmen, ever the practical one, cut to the heart of the matter. "What happens now? Are you in trouble with the Army?" "Agent, Chun, who'd been quietly observing the reunion, stepped forward. The military prosecutor's office has agreed to recommend administrative discharge rather than court-martial, given Staff Sergeant Vasquez's service record and the circumstances of her disappearance. She lose some benefits, but she won't face jail time. Elena nodded, having expected as much. It's fair. I broke my oath when I deserted, even if I had reasons. Her father shook his head. You didn't break anything that mattered. You served with honor, and when the system failed you, you found another way to serve. That's what soldiers do. We adapt and overcome. The family conference continued for another hour, with plans made for Elena's return home and the slow process of rebuilding relationships strained by months of deception. But as the sun set over the city, Elena felt something she hadn't experienced since before Kandahar, the possibility of a future that included both her past and her present. The next morning brought revelations that shocked even Agent Chun. Morrison's cooperation had unlocked a federal investigation spanning 3 states, involving dozens of construction companies and hundreds of exploited workers. The Memorial Hospital was just the tip of an iceberg that included schools, government buildings, and infrastructure projects throughout the region. This is going to take years to fully investigate, Agent Chun explained during a briefing. We're going to need ongoing cooperation from witnesses, particularly someone with your investigative skills and credibility with immigrant communities. Elena considered the offer carefully. The FBI was essentially proposing that she continue the work. She'd started as Maria Gonzalez, but with official authority and legal protection. It was a chance to turn her months of invisible suffering into something meaningful, to build a bridge between the military service she'd lost and the civilian purpose she'd found. What about the other workers? Elena asked. Rosa, Miguel, Mrs. Chun, what happens to them? They're heroes in this investigation, Agent Chun replied. Without their willingness to come forward, even after being intimidated and threatened, we couldn't have built the cases we needed. They deserve recognition for that courage. The press conference was scheduled for that afternoon. Elena stood in the bathroom of the FBI building, staring at herself in the mirror one last time. Tomorrow she would no longer be Maria Gonzalez, the invisible cleaning lady. She would be Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez, the veteran who'd brought down a criminal empire. The transformation felt as significant as any she'd undergone in the military. At 2 p.m., Elena walked into a room full of reporters, cameras, and officials. The podium felt familiar. She'd briefed commanders and government officials in Afghanistan, had spoken at memorial services for fallen soldiers. But this was different. This time, she was speaking for people who had no other voice. 3 months ago, I took a job cleaning bathrooms at Morrison Construction. Elena began, her voice steady despite the cameras trained on her face. I was running from my own demons, trying to disappear into the kind of work that makes people invisible. But what I found there was a different kind of war, a war being fought against workers who couldn't fight back, against people whose only crime was seeking a better life for their families. She told the story methodically, like the intelligence briefing she'd given in combat zones. The systematic wage theft, the intimidation tactics, the threats of deportation used to silence complaints. She spoke about Rosa's dreams of citizenship, about Mrs. Chun's dignity in the face of harassment, about Miguel's determination to support his family despite injuries that should have qualified him for workers' compensation. These aren't just labor violations or immigration issues, Elena continued. These are attacks on the fundamental promise that America makes to everyone who contributes to our society, that hard work will be rewarded, that dignity will be respected, that justice will be available to all. The questions from reporters were predictable. Why had she deserted the army? Why hadn't she revealed her identity sooner? What did she hope to accomplish by coming forward now? Elena answered each one honestly, without self-pity or justification. She'd made mistakes, taken action she couldn't fully defend, hurt people she loved. But she'd also learned that healing sometimes required breaking open old wounds, that justice sometimes demanded personal sacrifice, that the best way to honor her military service was to continue serving in whatever capacity she could. The final question came from a young Latina reporter who identified herself as Rosa Mendez, not the Rosa from Morrison Construction, but someone who clearly understood the broader implications of the story. Staff Sergeant Vasquez, what would you say to other veterans who are struggling with invisible wounds, who feel like they've lost their purpose after leaving the military? Elena considered the question carefully. I'd tell them that purpose isn't something you find once and keep forever. It's something you choose, again and again, often in ways you never expected. I thought my service ended when I left Afghanistan, but it turns out I was just moving to a different battlefield. As the press conference ended and reporters filed out to write their stories, Elena felt the weight of transformation settling over her like new body armor. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, working with federal prosecutors, testifying in multiple trials, helping other exploited workers find their voices. It would be difficult, sometimes dangerous work that would keep her in the public eye when part of her still craved invisibility. But for the first time in 3 months, Elena felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. 6 months after the press conference, Elena stood in the same conference room at the FBI field office, but everything had changed. The walls were now covered with maps showing the scope of the federal investigation, organizational charts linking dozens of construction companies to criminal enterprises, and photographs of over 200 workers who had come forward with evidence of exploitation. Agent Chun had been promoted to lead the newly formed Human Trafficking and Labor Exploitation Task Force, with Elena serving as a civilian consultant and victim advocate. The Memorial Hospital project had been completely restructured, with union workers receiving fair wages and immigrant workers gaining legal protections through U visas and other programs. The Morrison Construction trials start next week, Agent Chun announced during the morning briefing. 12 defendants, including Morrison himself. The plea deals we've accepted from smaller players have given us enough evidence to guarantee convictions on the major charges. Elena nodded, reviewing her testimony notes. Over the past 6 months, she'd become expert at translating the experiences of exploited workers into language that federal prosecutors could use in court. It was delicate work honoring the dignity of people who'd been systematically dehumanized, while building legal cases strong enough to prevent future exploitation. The transformation hadn't been easy. Elena's administrative discharge from the Army had been finalized with an other than honorable designation that cost her most of her veterans' benefits. The media attention had brought both support and criticism, with some questioning her motives for deserting and others challenging her right to speak for immigrant communities. But the work itself had been healing in ways Elena hadn't expected. Each worker who came forward, each case that resulted in recovered wages or legal status, each policy change that strengthened protections, all of it felt like a form of combat, a way of serving that honored both her military training and her civilian awakening. Rosa Martinez had become Elena's closest collaborator in the victim advocacy work. Now legally documented through a U visa, Rosa was studying social work while helping other exploited workers navigate the legal system. The young woman's resilience and determination reminded Elena daily why the fight was worth continuing. "Elena, there's someone here to see you," Rosa announced, appearing in the conference room doorway. "He says he's from the Army." Elena's blood chilled. Despite assurances from prosecutors and her lawyer, she'd always feared that military authorities might change their minds about pursuing desertion charges. But when she saw the man waiting in the lobby, her fear transformed into confusion and then recognition. Colonel James Mitchell had been her commanding officer in Afghanistan, the man who'd recommended her for the Bronze Star after the convoy attack. He was older now, with gray threading through his brown hair and new lines around his eyes that spoke of too many memorial services and difficult decisions. "Staff Sergeant Vasquez," he said formally, then broke protocol by extending his hand. "It's good to see you alive." Elena shook his hand, searching his face for clues about why he was here. "Colonel Mitchell, I wasn't expecting to see me again." "I don't blame you." Mitchell gestured toward a quiet corner of the lobby. "Could we sit? I have something I need to tell you, and it's not easy." They settled into chairs by the window, sunlight streaming between them like a barrier Elena couldn't cross. Mitchell pulled out a manila folder. Elena had learned to dread manila folders and set it on the table between them. "First, I owe you an apology," Mitchell began. "After Kandahar, when you started showing signs of PTSD, I should have gotten you better help. Instead, I focused on maintaining unit readiness and preserving your career. I pushed for that fitness evaluation because I thought it would fast-track you into treatment, not because I doubted your competence." Elena felt tears threatening. "Sir, you don't need to." "Yes, I do. Because what you did here, exposing Morrison and helping those workers, it proves something I should have recognized months ago. You weren't broken by Kandahar, you were changed by it. There's a difference, and I failed to see it." Mitchell opened the folder, revealing documents Elena didn't recognize. "The Army's been reviewing your case, along with hundreds of others involving veterans with PTSD who received less than honorable discharges. There's a new program designed to correct injustices in how we handled mental health issues." Elena's heart began racing. "What kind of program?" "Your discharge is being upgraded to honorable, effective immediately. Your benefits are being restored, including disability compensation for PTSD that should have been approved months ago. And there's something else." Mitchell pulled out another document. "The 75th Rangers want to award you the Meritorious Service Medal for your work with Morrison Construction. Apparently, using military skills to protect civilian populations counts as continued service to the nation." Elena stared at the documents, unable to process what she was seeing. After 6 months of living with the consequences of her desertion, the Army was not only forgiving her, they were honoring her. "Why?" she whispered. "Because leaders make mistakes. And sometimes the system needs to be corrected. Because what you did here demonstrates the values we try to instill in every soldier. Because those workers you protected are American citizens and permanent residents whose safety matters to national security." Mitchell leaned forward. "But mostly because it's the right thing to do." The ceremony took place the following week, at the local Army Reserve Center with Elena's family, her FBI colleagues, and dozens of the workers she'd helped in attendance. Rosa served as translator for Mrs. Chun's family, who had insisted on coming despite their discomfort with government ceremonies. As Colonel, Mitchell pinned the medal to Elena's dress uniform, the same uniform she'd thought she'd never wear again. Elena thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. The convoy attack in Kandahar that had shattered her sense of invincibility. The months of nightmares and drinking that had driven her to disappear. The desperate decision to become Maria Gonzalez, invisible and forgotten. But also the small kindnesses that had sustained her. Rosa's daily greetings, Mrs. Chin's shy smiles, Miguel's stories about his own military service. The growing awareness that justice was something you had to fight for, not something that happened automatically. The recognition that serving others could heal wounds that had seemed impossible to treat. "Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez, Colonel," Mitchell announced to the assembled crowd, "for exceptional service in protecting vulnerable populations and upholding the values of the United States Army, both in combat and in civilian life." The applause was thunderous, but Elena barely heard it. She was focused on the faces in the audience, Rosa, beaming with pride, Mrs. Chun, nodding approval. Her parents finally seeing their daughter honored rather than condemned. Agent Chun, representing a law enforcement community that had embraced Elena as a colleague rather than judging her as a criminal. After the ceremony, Elena mingled with the crowd, accepting congratulations and answering questions about her future plans. The FBI had offered her a permanent position as a specialist in labor trafficking cases. Several universities had invited her to speak about veteran reintegration and immigrant rights. A publisher had approached her about writing a book, but the conversation that mattered most came from Miguel, who approached her near the end of the reception. The former infantry soldier looked healthier than he had at Morrison Construction, his workers' compensation case having been resolved and his injuries properly treated. "Sergeant," he said formally, then switched to the familiar tone they'd developed working together. "I wanted to thank you for showing me that our service didn't end when we came home. It just changed form." Elena smiled. "We're all still serving, Miguel, just on a different battlefield." As the reception wound down and people began to leave, Elena stood in the empty community center, still wearing her dress uniform and medal. 6 months ago, she'd been Maria Gonzalez, invisible and forgotten, cleaning toilets for a man who saw her as less than human. Tonight, she was Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez, honored veteran and advocate for the vulnerable, surrounded by people who respected her service and valued her voice. The transformation felt complete, but Elena knew it was really just beginning. Tomorrow would bring new cases, new challenges, new opportunities to serve. The Memorial Hospital would be finished next year, built properly by workers earning fair wages. Rosa would graduate from social work school and continue advocating for immigrant rights. Mrs. Chun would become a citizen, having passed her test with Elena's help, and Elena herself would continue the work of healing, not just her own wounds, but the wounds of a system that too often forgot the humanity of its most vulnerable members. It wasn't the military career she'd planned, but it was service nonetheless. And service, Elena had learned, was what gave life meaning. The war at home would continue, but Elena was no longer fighting it alone. The Memorial Hospital stood gleaming in the morning sun, its facade decorated with bronze plaques honoring veterans from every American conflict. Elena parked her FBI-issued vehicle in the visitor lot and walked through the main entrance, past the inscription etched in granite, "In honor of those who served and those who continue to serve." She was here for the dedication ceremony, not as a spectator, but as one of the featured speakers. The hospital had become a symbol of what was possible when corruption was exposed and systems were reformed. Built by union workers earning fair wages, it employed dozens of formerly undocumented immigrants who had gained legal status through the Morrison investigation. The medical staff included several veterans struggling with PTSD, hired through programs Elena had helped design. Dr. Sarah Kim, the hospital's chief administrator, met Elena in the lobby. A Korean War veteran's daughter who had dedicated her career to improving veteran health care. Dr. Kim had become both a colleague and friend over the past 3 years. "Ready for this?" Dr. Kim asked, gesturing toward the auditorium where hundreds of people were gathering for the ceremony. Elena straightened her blazer. She rarely wore her dress uniform anymore, preferring the professional civilian attire that marked her new role as Director of Labor Rights and Veteran Services for the FBI, as ready as anyone can be for public speaking. The past 3 years had transformed Elena's life in ways she couldn't have imagined during those dark months as Maria Gonzalez. The Morrison Construction investigation had expanded into a nationwide crackdown on labor trafficking, resulting in over 300 arrests and the recovery of more than $50 million in stolen wages. Elena had testified before Congress, consulted on federal legislation, and helped establish victim services programs in 12 states. But the work that meant most to her happened on a smaller scale. Individual cases where her intervention meant the difference between exploitation and dignity. Like the farm workers in California who received legal status after exposing unsafe pesticide exposure. Like the hotel workers in Florida who organized with Elena's help to demand fair wages and workplace safety. Like the construction workers in Texas who used Elena's training to document wage theft and win a landmark settlement. Each case reminded Elena why she'd first put on a uniform: to protect people who couldn't protect themselves, to serve something larger than her own survival, to stand between the vulnerable and those who would exploit them. As Elena took the stage at the dedication ceremony, she looked out at an audience that represented the full spectrum of American diversity. Veterans from every branch of service sat beside immigrant families whose children translated for elderly parents. FBI agents and prosecutors mingled with social workers and union organizers. Rosa Martinez sat in the front row, now a licensed social worker and Elena's deputy director, her citizenship certificate framed on her office wall. 3 years ago, Elena began, her voice carrying easily through the auditorium's sound system. This hospital was supposed to be built with substandard materials by workers who were systematically cheated out of their wages. It was going to be a memorial to veteran sacrifice, built through the sacrifice of people who had no voice and no choice. She paused, letting her eyes sweep across the audience. Today, it stands as proof that America's promise, that hard work will be rewarded, that dignity will be respected, that justice will be available to all, is not just rhetoric. It's a goal we can achieve when we're willing to fight for it. Elena told the story of the investigation, but not the way she'd told it hundreds of times before in courtrooms and congressional hearings. This time, she focused on the people, Rosa's determination to become a citizen, Mrs. Chun's quiet dignity in the face of harassment, Miguel's refusal to let his injuries define his worth. She spoke about the dozens of workers who had found their voices through the legal process, who had transformed from victims into advocates. The memorial plaques outside honor veterans who served in foreign wars, Elena continued. But this hospital itself honors a different kind of service, the service of people who build our communities, clean our offices, care for our families, and ask only for the dignity and respect that should be every worker's right. The applause was sustained and heartfelt, but Elena barely heard it. She was thinking about the conversation she'd had that morning with Agent Chun, who was now running the FBI's Human Trafficking Division. A new case had come in a network of restaurants across the Southeast that were exploiting undocumented workers through debt bondage and threats of deportation. It would require months of undercover work, careful relationship building with traumatized victims, and the kind of patient investigation that had become Elena's specialty. After the ceremony, Elena lingered in the hospital lobby, accepting congratulations and discussing future collaborations with various organizations. But the moment that stayed with her came when Mrs. Chun approached, accompanied by her grandson David, who was now a sophomore at the local university studying criminal justice. "Ms. Elena," Mrs. Chun said in carefully practiced English, "I want to tell you something." Elena knelt slightly to be at eye level with the older woman, a gesture of respect she'd learned from spending time in immigrant communities. "When you were Maria, cleaning toilets, I knew you were different," Mrs. Chun continued. "You moved like someone used to giving orders, not taking them. But you also moved like someone who understood what it meant to be invisible." Elena nodded, remembering those early days when she'd felt like she was drowning in other people's indifference. "Now you help people become visible again. You give them back their voices. That is very powerful magic." David translated as his grandmother continued in Mandarin, then looked up at Elena with shining eyes. "She says that in China, there's a saying, when the small fish help each other, they can swim against the current. She says you taught her that small fish can become big fish if they work together." Elena felt tears threatening and blinked them back. "Please tell your grandmother that she taught me something too. She taught me that dignity doesn't come from what job you do or what uniform you wear. It comes from how you treat others, especially when no one is watching." As the crowd dispersed and the hospital settled into its regular rhythm of healing and service, Elena walked through the halls one final time. Each department told a story of transformation. The psychiatric unit where veterans received trauma. Counseling without stigma. The occupational therapy center where injured workers learned new skills. The family clinic where undocumented immigrants received health care without fear of deportation. In the pediatric ward. Elena paused at a play area where children's artwork covered the walls. One drawing caught her attention, a crayon sketch of people in different uniforms. A soldier, a police officer, a doctor, a janitor, a construction worker. Above them, in a child's unsteady handwriting, were the words, "All Heroes." Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Elena smiled, thinking about the child who had drawn this picture. Probably the son or daughter of someone who worked at the hospital, someone who understood that service came in many forms, and that every job done with dignity contributed to the community's well-being. Her phone buzzed with a text from Rosa. New. Case briefing at 2 p.m. Looks like another big one. Ready to get back to work? Elena typed back. Always ready. 5 years later, the lecture hall at George Washington University was packed beyond capacity, with students sitting in the aisles and faculty members standing along the walls. Elena had become a sought-after speaker at universities across the country, but she particularly enjoyed talking to criminal justice students who were preparing for careers in law enforcement and victim advocacy. How many of you have ever felt invisible? Elena asked the audience. About half the hands went up, mostly from students who looked like they came from working-class families or immigrant communities. Keep your hands up, Elena continued. Now, how many of you have ever made someone else feel invisible? The hands wavered, then slowly lowered as students recognized the uncomfortable truth in the question. Elena walked closer to the audience, abandoning the podium for the more personal connection she preferred. I spent 3 months invisible, not by choice, but because circumstances forced me to become someone I wasn't in order to survive. What I learned is that invisibility is often a weapon wielded by the powerful against the powerless. Making people invisible makes it easier to exploit them, to ignore their suffering, to deny their humanity. She told the story once again, but refined through hundreds of retellings into something like a modern parable. The students listened with the intensity she'd learned to expect from young people who understood that the world they were inheriting had deep flaws that would require their generation's commitment to fix. During the question and answer session, a young Latina student raised her hand. Ms. Vasquez, my parents are undocumented, and I grew up watching them live in constant fear. How do I become someone who can protect people like them without betraying my own family's trust? Elena considered the question carefully. The work of justice requires us to be strategic about when to be visible and when to work behind the scenes. Your parents trusted you with their truth because they knew you would protect it. Now you have to decide how to use that trust to help others without violating the confidence they placed in you. She paused, thinking about her own family's journey through her transformation from Maria to Elena. The most powerful advocacy often comes from people who understand the communities they're serving from the inside. Your experience gives you credibility and insight that someone like me, despite my good intentions, will never have. Use that wisely. After the lecture, Elena was approached by Dr. Martinez, a professor of criminology who had been following Elena's work for years. Elena, I have a proposition for you. We're developing a new graduate program in labor rights and human trafficking. Would you consider joining our faculty? The offer was tempting. Elena had been thinking about her next chapter, about how to continue serving while also creating institutional change that would outlast her individual efforts. Teaching the next generation of investigators and advocates felt like a natural evolution of her work. I'd need to maintain my consulting relationship with the FBI, Elena said. And I'd want to ensure that students get real-world experience working on active cases. Absolutely. We're envisioning a program that combines academic rigor with practical application. Your field experience would be invaluable. As Elena drove home that evening, she thought about the conversation and what it might mean for her future. The FBI work had been fulfilling but exhausting, requiring constant travel and exposure to the worst aspects of human exploitation. Teaching would allow her to multiply her impact while maintaining a more sustainable work-life balance. Her phone rang as she pulled into her driveway. Rosa's name appeared on the screen. "Elena, we got him." Rosa's voice was triumphant. "Martinez. Construction. The wage theft ring in Arizona. The CEO just pled guilty to all charges. Restitution for 300 workers, plus criminal penalties that will send him to federal prison for 8 years. Elena felt the familiar surge of satisfaction that came with successful prosecutions. Each victory meant real people would receive justice, would have their dignity restored, would be able to move forward with their lives. "How are the workers handling it?" Elena asked. "Better than I expected. Most of them are relieved it's over, and the restitution payments will help them rebuild their lives. Several have asked about joining our victim advocacy training program." After hanging up, Elena sat in her car for a few minutes, watching the sun set over the suburban neighborhood she now called home. It was a far cry from the dingy studio apartment where Maria Gonzalez had hidden from the world, but the journey between those two places felt like more than just a change of address. It felt like a resurrection. 8 years later, the congressional hearing room was formal and intimidating, with its high ceilings, ornate woodwork, and rows of cameras documenting every word for history. Elena sat at the witness table, flanked by Rosa Martinez, now Dr. Rosa Martinez, director of the National Labor Rights Institute, and Miguel Santos, who had become a union organizer and immigrant rights activist. The House Subcommittee on Immigration and Labor was considering the Dignity at Work Act, comprehensive legislation that would strengthen penalties for labor trafficking, expand protections for whistleblowers, and create pathways to legal status for exploited workers. Elena had spent 2 years helping draft the bill, drawing on hundreds of cases and thousands of conversations with both victims and law enforcement. Congressman David Park, the subcommittee chairman, called the hearing to order. "We're here today to discuss legislation that could fundamentally change how America protects vulnerable workers. Our witnesses bring decades of experience in both investigating these crimes and serving the victims." Elena had testified before Congress many times, but this felt different. This wasn't just about exposing corruption or seeking justice for individual cases. This was about changing systems, about creating protections that would prevent future Maria Gonzalez's from having to choose between exploitation and invisibility. "Professor Vasquez," Congressman Park began, using the title Elena had earned during her 5 years teaching at GWU. "Can you explain to the committee why existing laws are insufficient to address modern labor trafficking?" Elena leaned forward, her voice carrying the authority she'd developed through years of advocacy. "Congressman, current laws treat labor trafficking as primarily an immigration issue rather than a worker rights issue. This approach forces victims to choose between seeking justice and risking deportation. The Dignity at Work Act would change that by providing immediate legal protections for anyone who reports labor violations, regardless of their immigration status." She spent the next 20 minutes outlining the bill's key provisions, drawing on specific cases to illustrate how the reforms would work in practice. The questions from committee members were pointed but respectful, reflecting the bipartisan support the legislation had generated. The most emotional moment came when Rosa testified about her own experience, speaking with the eloquence that had made her one of the country's most effective immigrant rights advocates. 8 years ago, I was a young woman working at a construction company. Afraid to speak up about the harassment and wage theft I witness daily, Rosa said, her voice steady despite the weight of memory. I was afraid because I believed the lies my employers told me, that I had no rights, that complaining would only lead to deportation, that people like me didn't matter to people like you. She paused, looking directly at the committee members. What changed everything was having someone believe that my dignity mattered, that my voice deserved to be heard, that my dreams of citizenship were worth fighting for. The Dignity at Work Act would ensure that every worker in America has access to that same belief, that they matter, that they have rights, and that their government will protect them when they find the courage to speak. The applause from the gallery was spontaneous and prolonged, forcing Chairman Park to gavel for order. But Elena could see that Rosa's words had affected several committee members, including some who had been skeptical about the legislation. Miguel's testimony focused on the economic benefits of the bill, drawing on his experience organizing workers across multiple industries. When workers are protected from exploitation, everyone benefits, he argued. Wages rise, working conditions improve, and businesses that play by the rules can compete fairly against those that rely on illegal labor practices. The hearing continued for 3 hours, with committee members asking detailed questions about implementation, costs, and potential unintended consequences. Elena answered each query with the precision she'd learned from military briefings and FBI testimony, but also with the passion she'd developed through years of seeing how policy decisions affected real people's lives. As the hearing concluded, Chairman Park announced that the committee would vote on the bill the following week. I want to thank our witnesses for their comprehensive testimony and their years of advocacy on behalf of vulnerable workers. Their work has helped us understand not just the scope of the problem, but the solutions that can make a real difference. After the hearing, Elena, Rosa, and Miguel walked to a nearby restaurant to debrief over dinner. The conversation was optimistic but cautious. They'd seen too many promising bills die in committee to celebrate prematurely. Whatever happens with the legislation, Miguel said, raising his glass of water in a toast, we've already changed things. The workers we've helped, the cases we've won, the systems we've reformed. That's real change that can't be voted away. Elena nodded, thinking about the hundreds of people whose lives had been transformed through their work. Each successful prosecution, each recovered wage payment, each worker who gained legal status or found their voice, all of it mattered, regardless of what happened in Congress. To the work that continues, she said, raising her own glass. 10 years later, the retirement ceremony at FBI headquarters was smaller than Elena had expected, but more meaningful. Agent Chun, now Assistant Director Chun, presented Elena with a service award recognizing her decade of contribution to federal law enforcement. Rosa, Miguel, Mrs. Chun, now 85 and a proud American citizen, and Elena's family filled the front rows of the modest auditorium. Professor Elena Vasquez has served this nation in uniform and out of uniform, in war zones and in conference rooms, in congressional hearings and in community centers, Assistant Director Chun said during her remarks. But what I'll remember most about Elena is her ability to see the humanity in every case, to remember that behind every statistic is a person deserving of dignity and justice. Elena's own remarks were brief, focusing on the team approach that had made their work successful. Law enforcement is ultimately about protecting communities, she said. But communities are protected not just by arrests and prosecutions, but by ensuring that every member, regardless of their immigration status, their language, their job, or their background, knows they have value and rights that will be defended. The reception afterward was informal, with colleagues and friends sharing stories and looking through photo albums documenting a decade of investigations. Elena found herself standing before a display case containing artifacts from major cases. Morrison's fake construction permits, forged immigration documents from a restaurant trafficking ring, Wage records showing systematic theft from hundreds of workers, but the display also contained positive items, photos from naturalization ceremonies, graduation pictures from workers who had gone on to earn degrees, newspaper clippings about policy changes, and letters from victims expressing gratitude for the chance to rebuild their lives. Dr. Kim, from the Memorial Hospital, approached Elena near the end of the reception. Now in her 70s but still sharp and energetic, she had become a close friend over the years. "What's next for you?" Dr. Kim asked. "I can't imagine you sitting still in retirement." Elena laughed. "I'm not retiring exactly. The university has offered me an endowed chair in human rights and social justice. I'll be teaching, doing research, and mentoring the next generation of advocates. Plus, Rosa's convinced me to help write a book about our experiences. A memoir? More like a handbook for people who want to make change but don't know where to start. Too many people think activism requires grand gestures or special qualifications. But most of the important work happens through small acts of courage performed by ordinary people who decide they've seen enough injustice." As the reception wound down, Elena found herself alone in the FBI lobby, looking at the agency's seal and motto: fidelity, bravery, integrity. She thought about her journey from Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez to Maria Gonzalez to Professor Elena Vasquez, and how each identity had been necessary for the person she'd become. The past 10 years had brought professional success beyond anything she'd imagined when she was cleaning toilets at Morrison Construction. The Dignity at Work Act had passed Congress and been signed into law, providing protections for millions of workers. Her university program had graduated over 300 advocates who were now working in communities across the country. The FBI's Human Trafficking Division had grown from a small task force to a major department with offices in every field division. But the real measure of success wasn't in policy victories or institutional changes, it was in the individual lives that had been transformed. Rosa had finished her PhD and was running for Congress. Miguel had opened a nonprofit legal clinic serving immigrant workers. Mrs. Chun had lived to see her grandson David graduate from law school and join the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division. As Elena walked out of the FBI building for the last time as an active consultant, she thought about the conversation she'd had that morning with a new client at the university's legal clinic. A young woman named Isabel, recently arrived from Honduras, had been exploited by a cleaning company that confiscated her documents and threatened her with deportation when she complained about unpaid wages. "I feel invisible," Isabel had said, through a translator. "Like I don't matter, like no one sees me." Elena had looked at the young woman, barely 20, scared but determined to seek justice, and seen herself 10 years earlier. Not Maria Gonzalez, the cleaning lady, but Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez, lost and broken, and convinced she had nothing left to offer the world. "You matter," Elena had told Isabel, "and you're not invisible anymore. We see you, we believe you, and we're going to help you get justice." It was the same promise Elena had received from Davidson and Agent Chun a decade ago. The same promise Rosa had received when she first found the courage to speak up. The same promise that had given Miguel the strength to become an organizer. Instead of accepting defeat, the promise that in America, the real America, not the version that exploited the vulnerable, every person had value, every voice deserved to be heard. And every injustice could be challenged by ordinary people willing to do extraordinary things. 15 years later, the auditorium at George Washington University was packed with graduating students, their families beaming from the audience as Dean Martinez Rosa's title after her successful run for Congress and subsequent return to academia called each name for recognition. Elena sat on the platform with other emeritus faculty, watching her final cohort of graduate students receive their degrees in human rights and social justice. Each student represented years of mentorship, training, and shared commitment to protecting vulnerable communities. They would go on to work for the FBI, immigration nonprofits, labor unions, and civil rights organizations. Some would run for office, others would become teachers, and a few would start their own advocacy organizations, but all of them understood the central lesson Elena had spent 15 years teaching, that justice wasn't an abstract concept or a distant goal, but something that had to be created daily through countless small acts of courage and compassion. After the ceremony, Elena walked through the University Student Center, past displays highlighting the program's achievements, maps showing where graduates were working, statistics about cases won and lives changed, photos from naturalization ceremonies and community celebrations. But her favorite display was a simple quote wall where current students had written their personal mission statements. To ensure that no one has to choose between safety and speaking truth. To be the voice for those who have been silenced. 2. Remember that behind every case number is a human being deserving of dignity. To serve others the way I wish someone had served my family. Elena smiled, recognizing her own words reflected in these young voices. The work would continue long after she was gone, carried forward by people who understood that service came in many forms, and that the greatest honor was not in being recognized, but in recognizing others. Her phone buzzed with a text from Rosa. Final vote on the new American Workers Protection Act passes Senate 67-33. Presidential signature scheduled for next week. We did it again. Elena typed back, "We never stopped doing it. Congratulations, Senator Martinez." The title still felt new, even though Rosa had been in Congress for 3 years. Her election had been a triumph not just for immigrant rights, but for the principle that America was strongest when it elevated voices from every community, especially those who had been historically marginalized. As Elena prepared to leave campus, for the final time as an active faculty member, she took one last walk through the halls where she'd taught hundreds of students about the intersection of law enforcement, human rights, and social justice. The walls were lined with photos from guest speakers, field trips to federal agencies, and graduation ceremonies spanning 15 years. But the image that stayed with her was simpler. A candid photo from her first year teaching, showing Elena at a whiteboard covered with case law and policy frameworks, surrounded by a diverse group of students whose faces reflected complete engagement with the material. She remembered that class discussion about the ethics of undercover work, the debate about whether the ends justified the means when investigating exploitation. One student had asked whether Elena ever regretted her time as Maria Gonzalez, whether she thought the deception had been justified by the results. "Regret is the wrong word," Elena had answered. "I regret that circumstances forced me to disappear from my own life. I regret the pain that caused my family and the military unit that trained me. But I don't regret learning what it felt like to be invisible, because that experience taught me to see people who are overlooked by others." She had paused, looking around the classroom at students from every background imaginable. The question isn't whether deception is justified. It's whether we're willing to do whatever it takes to protect the vulnerable, even when that service isn't recognized or rewarded. Now walking across campus for the last time, Elena understood that her entire career had been built on that principle. From Afghanistan to Morrison Construction to the FBI to the university, she had served in whatever capacity was needed, wearing whatever uniform was required, accepting whatever recognition or condemnation came with the territory. The important thing wasn't the uniform, it was the service. 20 years later, the documentary crew had been following Elena for 6 months, documenting her daily routine for a film about veteran advocates and social justice movements. At 72, Elena moved more slowly than she had during her FBI days, but her mind remained sharp and her commitment unwavering. Today they were filming at the Memorial Hospital, now expanded into a full medical campus that served as a model for trauma-informed healthcare. Elena served on the board of directors, helping ensure that the facility continued to honor both military veterans and civilian heroes who served their communities in less visible ways. Tell us about the moment you decided to contact the documentary filmmaker asked as they walked through the hospital's hall of service, lined with photographs and stories of veterans, first responders, healthcare workers, teachers, and community activists. Elena paused in front of a display about Morrison Construction and the investigation that had launched her second career. The photo showed a much younger Elena in FBI gear, Rosa as a frightened young woman, Mrs. Chin before her citizenship ceremony, Miguel before his transformation into a labor organizer. I think I knew from the first day that I couldn't stay Maria Gonzalez forever, Elena said slowly. The question was whether I would find the courage to become Elena Vasquez again, and what version of that person I wanted to be. She moved to another display, this one showing the current state of labor rights enforcement. The statistics were encouraging. Wage theft prosecutions had increased by 400% since the Dignity at Work Act. Workplace safety violations had decreased significantly, and over 50,000 workers had gained legal status through whistleblower protections. Do you think the changes are sustainable? The filmmaker asked. Elena considered the question carefully. Change is never permanent. It has to be defended and renewed by each generation. But I'm optimistic because I see young people who understand that justice isn't a destination you reach once and stay forever. It's something you have to choose again and again, especially when the choice is difficult. The interview concluded at Elena's favorite spot in the hospital, the children's playroom where family members waited during medical procedures. The walls were still covered with artwork, but the pictures had evolved over the years. Children now drew police officers and soldiers alongside teachers and janitors, doctors and construction workers, all labeled with variations of heroes and helpers. After the documentary crew left, Elena sat alone in the playroom, thinking about the trajectory of her life. The young soldier who had enlisted to serve her country could never have imagined the path that service would eventually take. The broken veteran who had become Maria Gonzalez could never have envisioned the healing that would come through helping others find their voices. But perhaps most remarkably, the cleaning lady who had scrubbed toilets in silence had evolved into someone whose voice was heard in congressional hearings, university classrooms, and policy debates across the nation. Her phone rang. Rosa, now preparing for her third Senate term and chairing the Judiciary Committee's Immigration Subcommittee. Elena, I have news. The Justice Department is creating a new Office of Labor Rights Protection, and they want to name it after you, the Elena Vasquez Center for Worker Justice. Elena laughed. I'm not dead yet, Rosa. Isn't it traditional to wait for that? Traditional maybe, but not necessary. Your work has created the foundation for everything we've accomplished in this field. It's time to make that official. After hanging up, Elena sat in the quiet playroom, surrounded by children's artwork celebrating everyday heroes. She thought about the irony of having her name on a federal building when she'd spent months trying to erase her identity entirely. But perhaps that was the point. Perhaps the greatest service came not from staying hidden or seeking recognition, but from being willing to transform to become whoever you needed to be in order to protect others, to speak truth to power, to ensure that the most vulnerable members of society knew they had value and rights worth defending. The Memorial Hospital hummed around her with the quiet efficiency of healing and service. Somewhere in the building, doctors were treating patients regardless of their ability to pay or their immigration status. Nurses were providing comfort to families facing their darkest hours. Therapists were helping veterans process trauma without shame or stigma. All of it was possible because 20 years ago, a broken soldier had found the courage to stop running from her own pain and start fighting against the pain inflicted on others. Elena stood up slowly, her knees protesting the movement, but her spirit still strong. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, There were always new forms of exploitation to expose, new policies to advocate for new victims who needed to know they weren't alone. But tonight, she would go home to the family that had waited for her. Through disappearance and resurrection, to the sister who had forgiven her for the months of believing she was dead. To the parents who had learned to be proud not just of their daughter's military service, but of her civilian advocacy. And she would sleep peacefully, knowing that somewhere in the country, a worker was finding the courage to report exploitation because they knew systems existed to protect them. A veteran was seeking help for PTSD because the stigma had been reduced. An immigrant was pursuing citizenship because they believed their dreams mattered. The work continued, carried forward by thousands of people who understood that true patriotism meant ensuring that America's promises extended to everyone, especially those whose voices had been silenced. Elena walked through the hospital lobby one final time, past the bronze plaques honoring veterans of foreign wars and the newer displays, celebrating civilian heroes whose service was no less important. She paused at the inscription that had greeted her 20 years ago, in honor of those who served and those who continue to serve. The words meant something different now. Service wasn't confined to military uniforms or government badges. It was the teacher who stayed late to help struggling students, the social worker who fought for children in foster care, the organizer who helped workers demand dignity, the advocate who ensured that the vulnerable weren't forgotten. It was Maria Gonzalez cleaning toilets while documenting injustice. It was Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez finding purpose in civilian advocacy. It was Professor Vasquez training the next generation of human rights defenders. It was everyone who chose to see others when society preferred them invisible, to speak for others when they had been silenced, to serve others when service required. Sacrifice. As Elena stepped into the evening air, she looked up at the stars barely visible above the city lights. Somewhere out there, new battles for justice were beginning, fought by people who might never receive recognition or reward, but who understood that some things were worth fighting for regardless of the cost. The war for human dignity never ended. But neither did the soldiers willing to fight it. Elena smiled and headed home, ready for whatever tomorrow would bring.